Hello there. I'm Jim Zirin. You're watching Conversations in the Digital Age. With us is an old friend, Elliott Abrams. Elliott Abrams has held a number of senior foreign policy positions in Republican administrations of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush and George Bush. And he is also a senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Of course, the Middle East is foremost in everyone's mind today, with the U.S. airstrikes in Syria. So, Elliott, what do you make of the present situation?
Well, I think we should have done airstrikes like this 2 years ago. And I'm not making it up. It's on the record. I testified in Congress. I think we're doing this in theory to help the Syrian rebels against ISIS. The Syrian rebels could have used this help 2 years ago. There might not have been an ISIS. The question now is, how much are we doing? And is it enough? Air power only, no boots on the ground, the president assures us. Is it enough actually to affect the military situation on the ground? A lot of people who say no.
Certainly that's the position of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's rather unusual for a Joint Chiefs chairman to contradict his commander-in-chief in testimony before Congress, isn't it?
It is, and the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Odierno, a couple of days later, essentially did the same thing, saying, look, we need boots on the ground. It is perhaps not necessary that they be American boots, but the notion that air power alone can do this is not persuasive. But I have to say about the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, 2 years ago, General Dempsey said, we cannot possibly think of bombing Syria until we do 700 sorties in advance to suppress their air defense system, which is terrifying. Fast forward to 2014, and all of a sudden we're bombing Syria, haven't lost any planes. This is, I think, the kind of testimony that no chairman of the Joint Chiefs should be permitted to give, because it's not military advice, it's a political position. He didn't want to do it, so he said, well, we need 700 sorties, which was absurd at the time. You may remember the Israelis were bombing Syria then every other week without losing a plane. So you do have a record here, I think, of Dempsey politicizing this, saying what he thinks about what he wants to do, which sometimes is what the president wants to do and sometimes isn't, but it really shouldn't be permitted.
Don't you think that we at least had the tacit consent of the Syrian government in this instance? There's certainly a report that we advised the Syrian ambassador of the United Nations.
Probably. Assad thinks we're going to bomb ISIS only, and we're not going to bomb any of his positions, which the president has refused to do for a couple of years now. So from Assad's point of view, it's probably a good idea. I don't quite see why we had to advise him of what we were doing, and I think it shows another error the administration has made. We should have recognized a Syrian rebel force as a kind of government in exile. Then we get their permission to bomb, and we don't need to talk to Assad.
Now, we were joined in these strikes by 5 Arab nations, whom we call our allies in the attack. It's kind of, they're all sort of strange bedfellows, aren't they? And we have Saudi Arabia, we have the Emirates, Jordan, there are undoubtedly others, Qatar. Turkey was not a participant, right, but they're certainly cheering for us, we would think, with all the refugees crossing the border. What do you make of this? And are they to be trusted, and what do they want out of the deal?
We have one clear, though narrow, common interest, ISIS. They are as terrified by ISIS as they can be. ISIS views them as the near enemy. And the things that ISIS says and writes tell us that they view the United States as a thing they might get to in the future, but for now, the near enemy means exactly those Arab regimes. So it's very much in their interest to try to defeat it. I think we have to realize this is a kind of marriage of convenience when it comes to ISIS. With Qatar, for example, you know, there are terrorist groups they want to bomb, and there are terrorist groups they're financing. So this is not a complete identity of interests. It's a very narrow, momentary identity of interests.
The president, in talking about ISIS, used the cancer analogy, that he was going to excise this cancer from the face of the earth. And one always thinks in terms of cancer, how did it arise? How did it happen? How did ISIS happen?
Well, this is a very good question, and I think there's an answer to this question. When the Arab Spring or Arab Revolt started in 2011, they spread to Syria, and there was a revolt in Syria. Syria is a 75% Sunni country ruled by an Alawite kind of Shia denomination of Assad. The people,
certainly supported by Shias in Iran.
Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon. So they rose up. And the reaction was not to flee, which Mubarak did, flee from power or flee the country, as Ben Ali did in Tunisia. It was to fight. And now there are something like 200,000 dead in Syria, most of them Sunnis. So there's a government, a Shia government, slaughtering Sunnis. And what do we do about it? Nothing. Now we know that just days ago, Leon Panetta, former Secretary of Defense, said he had told the president, do something. Hillary Clinton in her memoir says she had told the president, do something. He refused to do it. Petraeus, when he was the head of the CIA, do something. No. So you create a situation in which Sunnis are being slaughtered, and Sunnis from all over the world begin to gather to defend their brethren. Now, unfortunately, the Sunnis that are gathering are terrorists from all over the world, jihadis from all over the world. We created a situation in which that became a great cause, and in which it was possible to recruit Sunnis, jihadis from all over the world to help defend their brethren in Syria. Now, I really think it is possible to blame the president for this, because every advisor he had was saying, we need to do something here. And he said no. And we now see
well, he himself said he wanted to do something, but because Syria had crossed a red line. Then he kicked the can over to Congress, which, while they were deliberating it, it just sort of died on the vine and nothing happened.
You know, I think he clearly did not want to do anything. This is the famous red line of August 2013. I think this will go down as one of the turning points and one of the low points in the Obama presidency, because the message is taken not only by the Syrians, but in Tehran and in Beijing and in Moscow. They see the president walk up to the line, having set a red line. I will strike you if you do that, and then walking away. I really think this will be the turning point in his foreign policy.
So do you think that emboldened our enemies, or indeed all over the world, emboldened Putin? And
I do. I think, you know, you can't draw straight lines and say, well, he wouldn't have gone into Ukraine if. But you can say that it left an impression of an indecisive president unwilling to use force.
Weak and ineffectual.
Good terms. I like that.
Well, it was, it's sort of interesting, because I suppose we would rather be hated and feared in the Middle East than hated and not feared.
Well, look, I think in the Middle East, that's quite right. And I would go beyond the Middle East. I think when you're dealing with somebody like Putin, the question of just brute strength is an important one, and the willingness to use that strength. And I think the president made a great mistake here. I don't think this is a partisan problem, because so many of the key advisors in his administration were urging him to do more. And in the Democratic Party today, I think there are a lot of critics of the way he is running this policy. So it's not a left-right division. It's not a Democratic-Republican division. It's, I think, criticism of a president who has mishandled this pretty badly.
But we're a war-weary country, is the other side of the coin, and certainly he ran on a plank that he would get us out of Iraq, and he did withdraw from Iraq, and you could debate whether that was an appropriate move at the time.
You know, I think people are, does anybody want another Iraq war, the $1 trillion and hundreds of thousands of men? No. But what was it? Go back to August 2013. You know, it was the kind of airstrikes we're doing now in Syria. Would have been all he needed to do then. Was anybody weary of that? If he had gone on TV and said, my fellow Americans, last night we did A, B, and C because we set a red line, he used chemical weapons. We're not going to leave our children a world where chemical weapons, you can write the speech. I don't think people would have been weary. I think they would have been supportive.
Do you think these strikes are going to do any good? Will they just leave a new vacuum in Syria?
They won't do any good if that's all we do. If you have a week or two of bombing, yeah, you'll weaken ISIS slightly, but they'll make it up. I think the question is, then what? If it's part of a broader program in Syria of real support for the rebels, of training, of arming, then I think it can make a difference, because you've got a three-way fight there: ISIS, the Syrian rebels, let's call them, and the regime. If you're really strengthening the rebels, yeah, the air power can help. Same thing's true in Syria. In Iraq. Our airstrikes are useful if they are followed up. If, for example, we really help the Kurds rebuild their army, the Peshmerga, yes, then it can make a difference on the ground.
Now, our attack was centered and focused on Raqqa in Syria, which is the de facto capital of ISIS.
Yes.
Was it wrong? I guess we've fanned out to other strategic locations as well.
And others, the Arab air forces can attack some other places. I think the idea here is in part to weaken the strong points of ISIS, but also to prevent it from spreading and taking over those areas. And there are still areas that are held by the non-jihadi Syrian rebels, the nationalist rebels.
And we also targeted this Khorasan group. Now, is that part of ISIS, or is that something else?
Yeah, you need a scorecard here, Jude. Yes, it's a related group of jihadis. There are some groups, all of this is related to al-Qaeda. Some groups closer to al-Qaeda, some have moved. ISIS had a lot of momentum. It seemed to be winning and growing, endlessly snowballing. And I think one of the things that we can do both in Iraq and Syria with these bombings is stop the momentum. And if you do that, I think you lead people and groups to say, well, maybe they're not going to win. And that, I think, will be a real contribution.
Do we know anything at this juncture whether any of these strikes have been effective?
No, I think it's going to be hard to tell. First of all, it's always hard. We're not on the ground in Syria. We are in Iraq. First problem. Second problem, well, what does effective mean? I mean, if you push ISIS back, and then a month from now, they retake all the territory, then you'd have to say it was not effective. I think it's going to be very difficult to judge, actually.
Now let's talk about these brutal beheadings which we've witnessed, which were accomplished by ISIS. There have been at least 3 and then probably more videotaped and put out on YouTube all over the world. Do you think it was the brutality, the stark brutality of it that motivated the president to action? And but for the beheadings, do you think he would have done anything?
I don't think he would have. I think he's responding to public opinion. I think the beheadings were a gigantic mistake on the part of ISIS, because they seem to have awakened a feeling in the American people. These are monsters. We really have to do something about this. We don't want to. We'd like it all to go away. We're tired of the Middle East.
20,000 people, how can they possibly affect our national interest?
But then you have these beheadings, and it looks as if, I think if you look at the opinion polls, in the course of the summer, they turn at the beheadings, and the president then responds, because the beheadings and the lack of a reaction were adding to a kind of crescendo. I think it began with Hillary Clinton's memoir, where she separated herself from the president on Syria. Panetta came later, but in my conversations with Democrats in Washington, I found that if you go back to, January, if pardon me, Republicans were critical of the president's foreign policy, they would defend him. This is just partisan nonsense, be quiet. By the summer, by June, July, that was not happening. Maybe it's because, the 2016 race is around the corner. But I was finding people, Democrats that is, including members of Congress, unwilling to defend the president's foreign policy, and more likely to say, yes, well, I agree with a good deal of what you're saying. I think we do have a problem here. Much more in the way of an attack on the president for not being sufficiently active. And the beheadings, I think, were the turning point there.
You don't see the beheadings as a possible ploy by ISIS to get us more involved and get us drawn into a new Mideast conflict?
I've heard that theory. I don't think so. I think, and there are a couple of things that have been written out there that suggest that they now view it as a mistake. If we're just doing this from the air, I don't think that possibility arises. Now, there is as you know, as you said a few minutes ago, The military does not think it's going to be possible to have the impact we want without troops on the ground. And let's be candid, we have troops on the ground. We have about 1,500.
In Iraq?
In Iraq.
Nothing in Syria.
Nothing in
Syria.
Syria. Well,
know about.
And who knows what the CIA has in Syria. And that number is going to grow. I mean, it's not going to grow to 50,000, but 1,500 can easily become 5,000 or 10,000. People of a certain age, like you and me, will remember.
That is a
Once
certain
upon
age.
a time, we had 10,000, quote, advisors in Vietnam, and that grew. So I think the president does need to watch the numbers carefully, or people are going to be saying, see, we told you so.
Beware the opening wedge. Now, you can't talk about the Middle East without talking about Israel.
Yes.
And Israel's gotten into the act in all this. They shot down a Syrian plane over the Golan just at the same time as we were doing all these airstrikes. Now, so they're weighing in on the other side.
Well, Israel has been involved over the last few years. Certainly in 2012 and 13, there were intermittent, maybe once every month or two, Israeli airstrikes. And what they were doing was they were trying to prevent arms from moving through Syria to Hezbollah. So they would knock off a warehouse or a convoy. Now, this was really Syria. That is, this was, in the last couple of days, a Syrian plane flying over Israel, and they weren't going to permit that. But the Israeli view has changed. A couple of years ago, the Israeli view was let well enough alone in Syria. Assad is the enemy we know. It's more or less orderly. The northern border is calm. Leave it alone. That's not their view anymore. First, because they don't think ISIS, I should say they don't think Assad is a formula for stability, because the people have essentially risen up against him. Second, because ISIS is growing, and sooner or later it will be a threat both to Jordan and to Israel. So I think they are supportive of this new coalition we're trying to build to prevent ISIS from growing anymore.
But of course, they can't participate in it.
No, they can't participate. They can. What they're doing, I think, what they're going to have to do. Well, I think they're going to reinforce their northern border. Once upon a time, they built this security fence between Israel and the West Bank. In the last couple of years, since the overthrow of Mubarak, they've built a similar security barrier along the Sinai. And it's not a fence, it's sort of a road, a fence, an electric fence, another road, and so forth. They're going to have to do that in the north, too, because that calm border with Syria is now not calm.
So, speaking of Israel, what about this 50-day war with Hamas in Gaza, which is recently concluded? I mean, who won the war?
I think Israel won the war.
Even though Gazans were dancing in the street and celebrating
they were
the
dancing
truce?
in the street briefly. And I say that because, why were they dancing in the street? First of all, because the fighting was over, so they could come out and be safe. There'd be no more airstrikes. But I think because the Hamas message was, life will now get better. Yes, we sacrificed, but the whole world is talking about a big reconstruction program. Billions of dollars are going to flow in. We'll rebuild your house better than it was. Thing is, that's not true. It's a lie. The war has been over now, what, a month or something like that. How much reconstruction is there? Nothing. How much reconstruction will there be between now and January? And remember, winter's coming, so it's going to be cold and rainy in Gaza. How much reconstruction? You think we're going to see vast flows of steel and cement and money? I don't. So I think that...
Well, there's strategic issues or military issues in steel and cement, because how do we know they're not going to rebuild the tunnels into Israel or tunnels into Egypt?
You have to monitor not only what goes in, but who's the end user inside Gaza. It's not going to happen.
So who's going to monitor all this?
There have been...
is Elliott Abrams going to go over there and make sure that cement isn't being used for tunnels?
I'm going to be busy in this period. But the EU has at one point said we would do this.
And where are they going to live?
This is a great question. Where are they going to live? They're going to live in Gaza, where they're under the influence and threat from Hamas? Are they going to live in Israel? Are they going to live in Egypt? Where
they'll live in Tel Aviv and go to nightclubs.
Well, then you have a lot of volunteers. In 2005, Sharon got out of Gaza. And we, the United States, set up a thing called the Agreement on Movement and Access to answer these questions. We negotiated it with the Israelis and Palestinians. At this point, it's not Hamas, it's the Palestinian Authority, and the Israelis and Palestinians are talking. We failed completely. In those much better circumstances, the thing was a dead letter the day it was written. I think this is going to be very hard. And I think that if you take an opinion poll in January and ask Gazans, do you think you won the war? You'll get a different answer.
Well, what did Hamas get out of the war, if anything?
I think Hamas went into this because their own situation in Gaza was becoming intolerable. You know, General Sisi had taken over and closed the smuggling tunnels between Gaza and Sinai, which were hugely important for the economy of Gaza and fiscally for Hamas because they taxed everything that went through. So Hamas was in a very bad way financially. Qatar had offered them a lot of money, and the Israelis and we blocked it because it's terrorist funding from our point of view and the European point of view. Hamas has tens of thousands of civil servants in Gaza, school teachers, policemen. They hadn't been paid in 6 months. So what does Hamas do? They went into a deal with the Palestinian Authority and said, you know what, come back. We'll do a coalition government of sorts, a non-party technocratic government, and you pay our civil servants. The Palestinian Authority said, yeah, let's do it. They sign, and they don't pay. So what does Hamas do? I think this was, in a certain sense, a desperate move on the part of Hamas. We need to shake things up. And
Well,
they did.
shook things up all right.
They shook things up.
Devastated their own country. So what is their popularity now in Gaza when people look around and see the devastation?
I think there is
Hamas's cause?
I think there's a temporary popularity for two reasons. One, these promises that things will get better and aid will flow in. And two, you know, resistance. I mean, Salam Fayyad, the former prime minister of the Palestinian Authority, said this year that there's something we need to recognize. We Americans need to recognize. We don't like it, but we need to recognize it. The idea of resistance to the Israeli occupation, has been captured by Hamas. We wish it had been captured by more moderate, more constructive forces, but it hasn't been. And I think this is a key to the Hamas popularity. For the Palestinian people, resistance to Israel really means Hamas.
Well, how do you suppose all this will play out? Do you think, do they have any rockets left to fire at Israel? And Israel's Iron Dome was fairly effective. And if they do, what is Israel going to do? I mean, Netanyahu said, of course, he will retaliate. Sharon had said he would retaliate, and he didn't. And
he did not. You're right.
You're
right.
So how's this going to play out?
I don't think Hamas wants another war because, as you said, there's a tremendous amount of devastation in Gaza, and I don't think the people of Gaza want more of the same. I think it plays out slowly and kind of sordidly as the amount of aid is quite low, and the people of Gaza are going to suffer. The question, I think, is partly political. That is, this rivalry between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. Do they go ahead with this coalition government of sorts? In recent days, they've been shooting at each other and jailing each other, that is Hamas and the PA. So my sense is that if you look ahead, 6 or 12 months, it's going to look a lot like it did in 2014, 2013, 2012. Every speech that people make in Europe and Secretary Kerry, the president, about the Israeli-Palestinian situation contains the word unsustainable. It's unsustainable. But it's very sustainable. I mean, it's been sustained since 1967. And I think if you look ahead a couple of years, it's going to be pretty much what you see now.
Well, Israel paid something of a price in the war, but what is all this going to do to the peace process? I mean, doesn't it set back the so-called peace process for years and years?
Well, it was pretty much
it was dead anyway.
Yeah, I mean, remember Kerry, early 2014, gigantic push for peace. And it ends in, March or April, and he essentially admits failure, and there was no real negotiating. The United States, the Kerry view was that they were negotiating very seriously. I don't believe it. I think that, if the United States pushes hard enough, and Kerry did, you get the Israelis and Palestinians to say, all right, let's go to the table with this guy. He's, the American Secretary of State. We'll talk to him. He wants us to. I don't want to appear recalcitrant. I don't think either side, the Israelis or Palestinians, were negotiating seriously. I don't think either side thought there was a chance to do a deal. They were at the table because Kerry implored, pleaded, begged, pushed, shoved to get them to the table. But I don't view it as having been a serious negotiation. So I don't think there was a peace process, and I don't think there is one now. I think we should be paying more attention to ways of improving life in Gaza, particularly in the West Bank. I'm talking about the economy. I think there's a lot more that could be done by donors, including us, and by Israel. And I think we make a mistake in focusing on a comprehensive peace that's going to get everybody, more Nobel Prizes and handshakes on the White House lawn, instead of a much more pragmatic look at how do we make this better.
Unfortunately, Elliott Abrams, we have to wrap up. I have a question for you. Are we at an inflection point in history in the Middle East?
No.
Why not?
More of the same.
More of the same.
I don't, you have a lot of legitimate regimes, mostly monarchies, a lot of illegitimate regimes, a lot of new regimes. It's going to be extremely untidy for a very long time.
Untidy for a very long time. Thank you so much for coming by. This has been just marvelous. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations on the digital age. I am Jim Zirin. Please visit our website at www.digitalage.org. Good night and all the best.